The first dump truck came up the gravel lane on a cold October morning in 2019, air brakes hissing, diesel smoke hanging in the mist. It did not stop at the house. It rolled past the sagging barn, backed up to the fence line of the east field, and then the hydraulics groaned, the bed tilted, the tailgate banged open, and 12 tons of apples came down in one long, rumbling cascade. Reds and golds and pale greens pouring out across the frost-burned grass, bouncing and splitting and rolling until they settled into a heap the size of a hay wagon. The driver never got out. An hour later, a second truck came, and after lunch a third. By the middle of the afternoon there were better than 40 tons of apples piled at the edge of a farm the county had given up on years ago, and the smell of bruised fruit was drifting on the cold air. They were culls from Marsh Point Orchards, the big commercial operation on the far side of the ridge, apples bruised in the harvest bins, apples nicked by hail, apples a quarter-inch too small or a shade too dull for the packing line. The grocery chains would not take them. The packing house had no room to hold them, and the landfill charged by the ton to bury them. Years back, the orchard had struck a quiet arrangement with the old man who farmed this place, dumped the culls on his back field, let the deer and the compost pile have them, and save everybody the tipping fees. The old man had been dead since winter, and nobody at the orchard had thought to ask whether the arrangement still stood. Cars slowed on the county road to look at the pile, one more indignity for a piece of ground the whole township agreed was finished. But the dead man's daughter stood at the fence with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, and the question she was turning over was not the one anyone would have guessed. It was this: if the only thing wrong with these apples was the way they looked, why was anybody throwing them away? Her name was Nora Hadley, and she was 51 years old that fall. The farm was 38 acres on the Fruit Ridge of western Michigan, and it had been her father's, and his father's before him. She had left it at 19, married, and spent almost 30 years keeping books for a school district downstate. A careful woman with a head for numbers and a habit of reading the fine print. Then, in the space of 2 years, she buried her husband and then her father, and the farm came to her the way old farms come to daughters, with a leaking barn roof, a dead tractor, 3 seasons of back taxes, and everyone's gentle advice to sell. Quick pause. Right here near the start. If stories like this keep landing in front of you, this channel is probably worth sticking around for. Go ahead and subscribe. And do one thing for me: tell me where you're watching from tonight down in the comments. I read every one. Now, back to the story. The advice was not unkind, and it was not even wrong exactly. The county extension agent had walked the place the summer before and said what everybody already knew: the ground was tired, the old rows her grandfather had planted along the fence lines were half wild and past saving, and nobody made 38 acres pay anymore, not against operations like Marsh Point, with their 1,000 acres, their packing house, and their contracts. The bank said roughly the same thing in colder language. Written off. That was the phrase underneath all of it. The phrase nobody said to her face: the land was written off, and so, she understood plainly, was the 51-year-old widow standing on it. She had been back 11 months when the trucks came, and she had spent most of those months trying to decide whether everyone was right. The morning after the third truck, before the sun was fully over the tree line, Nora Hadley walked out to the pile with a spiral notepad, a flashlight, a kitchen knife, and the tailgate of her pickup for a workbench. She did not call the orchard, and she did not call a lawyer. She sorted apples for 4 hours. 1 row for the bruised ones, 1 row for the hail marked, 1 for the small and the crooked and the badly colored, and 1 row, much shorter than she expected, for fruit that was honestly rotten. Then she started cutting. A bruise, she found, went in half an inch, maybe an inch on the worst of them, a soft brown shadow under the skin where the flesh had been struck in the bin, and beneath it, clean white apple all the way to the core. She ate a bruised Jonathan standing at the tailgate in the cold, and it was sweet and sharp and perfect. Rot was another matter entirely. Soft sunken rings, a dusty blue-green mold in the core, and rot went in its own row and would stay there. Then the bookkeeper and her took over the notepad. A bushel of apples weighs about 42 pounds. A decent press draws close to 3 gallons of cider from a bushel. 40 tons was nearly 2,000 bushels. She did the multiplication twice, wrote a number in gallons at the bottom of the page, and circled it. Then she went inside and called Marsh Point Orchards, not to complain, to ask when the next load was coming. What she learned that first month, she mostly learned the hard way, and the first lesson was the clock. A bruised apple is not a bad apple, but it is an apple that has started dying faster, the broken cells brown, the rot finds the wound, and fruit that would keep for months in cold storage will go soft in a week or two on a frost-covered field. If the pile was worth anything at all, it was worth something now. She rented a small hobby press from an outfitter downstate, set it up on the barn floor, and found out how slowly pressing goes when you do not know what you are doing. A whole weekend of grinding and pressing for a few dozen gallons of cloudy, sweet, astonishingly good cider. The neighbors bought jugs of it at the end of the driveway, some out of curiosity and some, she suspected, out of pity. Then a woman from the county health department stopped by, friendly as could be, and explained the second lesson. Fresh pressed juice cannot be sold to stores or restaurants without pasteurization and a written safety plan, and even at the farm gate it needs a warning label. There were rules and permits and inspections. The pity in town deepened considerably. The press she actually needed was sitting under tarps in a pole shed 12 miles north, and so was the man who knew how to run it. Walt Brenner had operated Brenner's cider mill on the state highway for better than 30 years, pressing custom loads every fall for half the small orchards on the ridge, until the small orchards disappeared and the mill closed with them. He was 72, wide as a doorway, and famous for going whole conversations without speaking. Nora drove up, laid out what she was doing, and waited through a silence long enough to reconsider her entire life. Then Walt walked her into the shed, pulled the tarps off a rack and cloth press the size of a chest freezer, and sold it to her for barely more than scrap price, on the single condition that she not ruin it. What came with it was worth more than the machine. Grind the fruit to a fine pomace, because the juice lives in broken cells. Build the cheeses in clean cloth, layer on layer, and press slow. The press does the work, the operator just keeps it honest. And scrub everything, every surface, every time, with water hot enough to hurt, because the bacteria that turn cider into vinegar ride on every apple, every board, and every hand in the county. Her first real batch nearly ended the whole thing. It was late November by then, the light failing by 5, and she was sorting 40 tons against a deadline with cold hands and a cheap work lamp, and she got careless. Soft fruit slipped through. Moldy cores slipped through. The blue-green mold that grows in a damaged apple produces a toxin called patulin, and patulin does not much care about pressing or filtering, and juice that carries too much of it cannot legally or morally be sold. When her lab results came back high, she stood in the barn for a while without moving. Then she pumped 300 gallons of sweet cider into the manure spreader and put it back on the field it came from. She allowed herself one evening of believing that everyone in town had been right. The next morning she rebuilt the sorting line, better light, waist-high tables, and a hard rule that any apple with a soft ring or a suspect core goes to the compost no matter how fast the line needs to move, and she never failed a test again. The second failure was the one that changed the shape of the business. That winter, she tried her hand at hard cider, fermenting a few barrels of late-season juice in the back room off the kitchen, and she kept them too warm and trusted the airlocks too long, and the bacteria Walt had warned her about found their way in. Acetobacter needs only cider, air, and patience, and it had all three. By February, the whole back room smelled like a pickle jar, and what was in those barrels was not hard cider anymore. It was young, raw apple cider vinegar. She was an hour from dumping it when Walt came by to look at the press fittings. He dipped a cup, tasted it, stood there in the cold with the taste for the better part of a minute, and then said the two words that turned out to be worth more than the press itself: sell it. Good cider vinegar, real vinegar, raw and unfiltered and aged on its mother, was something chefs and market shoppers paid serious money for, more per bottle, it turned out, than anyone on the ridge had ever paid for cider. Her mistake was a product. She bought oak barrels in the spring and started making the mistake on purpose. The slow way, months in the wood with the mother breathing on top. The hard cider itself had a quieter problem. It was boring. The culls coming off Marsh Point's line were supermarket apples, Gallus and Honeycrisps and McIntosh, bred for sugar and perfume, and fermented dry they made a cider that was thin, polite, and instantly forgettable. Walt named the disease over the rim of a glass: dessert fruit, no spine. The old cider makers wanted three things in a blend: sweet for the alcohol, sharp for the acid, and bitter for the backbone. The tannin that dries the mouth and makes the second sip follow the first. And the packing line would never dump the bitter kind, because nobody grows it anymore. But her grandfather's half-wild fence rows did. The scrub trees the extension agent had called past saving were seedling apples and crab apples, small and hard and spitting bitter, loaded every September and free for the picking 40 steps from the press. She started folding them into the grind, 1 part in 8, then 1 in 6, tasting as she went. The farm everybody had written off turned out to be growing, along its written-off fences, the one ingredient money could hardly buy. The second full season was the grind, and the grind was not cinematic. It was a used walk-in cooler bought at auction from a shut-down restaurant, hauled home in pieces, and rebuilt against the barn wall. So the clock on 40 tons of bruised fruit could finally be slowed. It was a federal winery bond and a state small winemaker license for the hard cider. Months of forms and fingerprints and floor plans. It was an ultraviolet pasteurizer for the sweet cider so the stores could legally shelve it, and a written safety plan with her initials on every page. It was racking barrels in an unheated barn in January with her breath hanging in the lamplight, and the acid softening on its own through the slow secondary ferment in spring, and label after label printed at the kitchen table, steamed off, and redesigned. Through all of it, the trucks kept coming, load by load, and the town kept being kind to her face. Then, in October of that second year, Walt Brenner drew a glass of the new blend off the tank: Honeycrisp sugar, McIntosh sharpness, her grandfather's bitter little fence row crabs underneath, held it up to the lamp, tasted it, and nodded once. "That's cider," he said. It was the highest praise she would ever hear from him, and she drove home with the radio off so as not to spill it. The market found her a little at a time, the way it does when the product is real. Saturdays she sold sweet cider and vinegar off a folding table at the farmer's market in town, and one of the people who stopped was a chef from the college town, who bought 2 bottles of the vinegar, called on Tuesday, and asked for a case a month. Chefs talk to chefs. By summer, the vinegar was in 6 restaurant kitchens and a specialty grocery, and the hard cider was pouring at a taproom on the lakeshore that liked telling the story of where it came from. Then came the call she had not planned for: a craft distillery 2 counties south wanted fermented cider by the tote as distilling stock for an apple brandy. She could not legally distill so much as a teacup herself without a federal spirits permit, and she had no wish to. She signed a supply contract instead and let their still and their license do that work, which meant the pile at the fence line was now feeding 3 separate streams: cider sweet and hard, vinegar and oak, and brandy in somebody else's barrels, and not one of them could exist without the fruit nobody wanted. By the fall of 2022, the third fall, the trucks from Marsh Point still came up the gravel lane, but now they called ahead. The orchard had worked out what its waste was worth to somebody, and it had quietly begun protecting the arrangement. Loads scheduled around her pressing days, the worst of the rot screened out back at the packing house, and a handshake understanding that the culls came to Hadley's first. 2 women from town worked the sorting tables in season, paid by the hour and glad of it. The barn had a new roof, paid for in full. The bank had stopped calling about the taxes. Nora Hadley never said a number out loud, and this story is not going to say one for her. She was raised to believe you do not discuss money with strangers, but her accountant, closing out the books that winter, told her the plain version. The farm the county had written off had just finished its best year since before she was born, and it was not close. Cars still slowed on the county road. There was a farm stand sign at the end of the lane now, and a line on Saturday mornings. People ask her at the market what the secret was, and she gives them the bookkeeper's answer. She did the arithmetic on something everyone else had already rounded down to 0. The orchard was not wrong about those apples. They were worthless to a system built to pay for flawless fruit, moving in flawless volume at flawless speed. The packing line and the grocery shelf had asked the apples one question: "How do you look?" and thrown away every answer but one. She had walked out to the fence and asked a different question. And the whole business, the press, the barrels, the vinegar mother breathing in the oak, the brandy contract, was nothing more than that different question, asked patiently, for 3 years. Most opportunity does not arrive looking like opportunity. It arrives looking like a mess, a pile dumped at your fence line, a machine under tarps in somebody's shed, a batch gone sour in the back room, a farm everyone has agreed to stop believing in. It arrives pre-labeled as waste, because somebody bigger and busier already decided it was not worth their time. And their deciding is precisely what leaves it lying there for you. The bruise, it turns out, is usually half an inch deep. Under it, more often than anyone would guess, the whole thing is still sweet. Somewhere near you, right now, there is probably something written off. A field, a building, a trade, a person, waiting on somebody willing to walk out to the fence and look at it long enough to ask the only question that ever mattered: what is actually wrong with this? Sometimes the answer is nothing. Nothing but the way it looks.